Hello and welcome to EU History Explained. In this series, we try to make sense of today's European Union by looking at its history. In the previous episode, we've seen that European integration started with several projects running in parallel, with the political integration track leading to the not very ambitious creation of the Council of Europe, and the economic integration track leading to the establishment of the European Coal and Steel Community. In these years, we also see a third track, that of military cooperation, that starts to develop. Initially, this is not much more than a military alliance, first among Western European countries and then between them and the United States, what we know today as NATO. But in the following decade, things evolved differently, leading to an attempt to create a fully fledged European defense. But we will see that this attempt will not be very successful, so to speak. So let's take a look at the international context in which these events unfold. It's the beginning of the 1950s, and the Cold War has been going on for a few years. In this context, the Korean War breaks out. What has happened there? Korea is divided in two states, the North, socialist and backed by the Soviet Union, and a US-backed capitalist South. In 1950, North Korea invades the South. This move spreads panic in the West, as the Korean situation dangerously reminds that of another country divided between a US-backed and a Soviet-backed state. This time at the heart of Europe, Germany. Therefore, the rearmament of Germany suddenly becomes an urgent priority for the United States. Of course, this meets the fierce opposition of France. But if the French want to avert this outcome, they need to come up with a counter-proposal that is convincing enough for the United States. So, applying the same logic of coal and steel, in 1950, the French Prime Minister René Pleven proposes the creation of a European defense community. In other words, a European army in which the German rearmament should be framed. The treaty establishing the European Defence Community will be signed by the 6 members of the European Coal and Steel Community in 1952. However, this community will never see the light. At this point, something quite interesting happens. The military and the political integration tracks start mingling together. The creation of a European army within the European Defence Community creates an important issue. Under whose authority will this army be, and who will ensure democratic control over it? Therefore, in 1952, starting from an initiative of the Italian government, the 6 members of the European Coal and Steel Community entrust the Common Assembly with the task of drafting what they call a European Political Statute. In other words, a constitution for a European supranational political union. The project of a European political community, as it is called, is very ambitious and has a clear federalist flavor, including a parliament that is partly elected by citizens and the establishment of a common market based on the free movement of persons, goods and capital. However, this community will dramatically fail due to the defeat of the European Defence Community. So let's get back there and see what happened. Once signed, the European Defence Community Treaty needs to be ratified by the signatory states. However, in the meantime, there have been some changes in the international context. First, a change in the US administration brings the Republicans to power, and the new president, Dwight Eisenhower, seems more reluctant than his predecessors to use the US budgets for Europe's defense. This instills the fear in some European allies that should the European Defence Community see the light, the US will use this as a pretext to abandon their role of guarantors of European security. Secondly, on the other side of the world, Stalin's death also seems to make the Soviet Union a little bit less scary. Finally, the European Defence Community project faces quite some internal opposition in France, where support for the treaty lies on a very precarious party constellation. Eventually, in 1954, the European Defence Community Treaty will fail to be ratified by the French Assembly, and the community that was a French creation will be abandoned. When it comes to the military realm, Europe's territorial security will remain firmly under the responsibility of NATO and the United States. The defeat of the European defence community also seals the fate of the European political community project. This is the failure of the grand project of a political union for Europe, but it is not the end of the dream of an ever closer union among the peoples of Europe. Europe is therefore left with one successful integration project, the European Coal and Steel Community. Jean Monnet, the French civil servant who first launched this idea, is convinced that this cooperation could be extended to other sectors, such as, for instance, nuclear energy. The Benelux countries are also very much in favor of further integration, and possibly to even extending it to all sectors of the economy. In 1955, these countries call on the other members of the European Coal and Steel Community to convene an intergovernmental conference in Messina, in Italy, to discuss the creation of a common market. The conference establishes a committee of the foreign ministers of the 6 countries, chaired by the Belgian Foreign Minister Paul-Henri Spaak, that is tasked with sketching out a future European Economic Community and European Atomic Energy Community. A number of key questions are debated in this phase. One is the nature of the common market. Should it be a mere free trade area, ultimately leaving to the member states leeway as to how to deal with third countries, or should there also be a common external tariff? Another question is the tension between the supranational character that was central in the European Coal and Steel Community and the intergovernmental character. Finally, the 6th debate also on whether and how the overseas territories of the member states should be included in the scope of the common market. The work of the foreign ministers leads to the signature in Rome in 1957 of 2 treaties, one establishing the European Economic Community and the other one establishing the European Atomic Energy Community, also known as Euratom. In this phase, the members of these 2 communities are the founders of the European Coal and Steel Community: France, Germany, Italy, Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands. Euratom's mission, that is strictly limited to civil applications of nuclear energies, is to contribute to the joint development of Europe's nuclear industries by distributing and regulating the use of nuclear energy. The treaty establishing the European Economic Community, on the other hand, is much more comprehensive. It establishes a common market protected by a common external tariff. It envisages the creation of a common agricultural policy, and it sets out rules for the free movement of persons, goods, and capital. A number of institutions are put in place. The European Parliamentary Assembly, with delegates appointed by the national parliaments, has deliberative and supervisory powers. The Council, that is made up of representatives from the national governments, is the key decision maker and adopts decisions mostly by unanimity. The Commission is composed of independent members appointed by the member states and has the power to submit proposals to the Council. The Court of Justice ensures the correct interpretation and application of the treaty. Finally, a European Economic and Social Committee is an advisory body that represents the social partners. So, in an attempt to limit the supranational character of this new community, instead of a high authority, we now have a commission, and most decision-making powers are conferred to the Council of Ministers. Finally, the question of overseas territories is solved with a compromise. The Euratom institutional structure mirrors that of the European Economic Community, with the Assembly and the European Economic and Social Committee being shared by the 2 communities. The European Economic Community will set the basis of the European Union as we know it today, and its success will strengthen the vision of those like Jean Monnet advocating for sectorial cooperation as the most effective way to achieve European integration. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to like, comment and subscribe to our channel. And stay tuned for more episodes about the history of the European Union coming soon.